All right, welcome to everybody. You're in the right place if you plan to join the session on connecting families and schools in a post-COVID world. I am Tim Daly, the CEO of EdNavigator, based in Chicago, where I am semi-supervising my 11-year-old and 9-year-old doing remote learning right now. A couple of reminders up front, and then I'll introduce my co-presenters. One is that the session is being recorded, so not only keep that in mind, but if you have to step away at all and you hope to come back and catch some parts that you missed later, this will be posted and up for 60 days, so you can get all the enjoyment of watching and rewatching this session at your leisure. And secondly, we're going to go through a presentation for the first half of the session that Dan and I will mostly lead, and then Terra is going to respond to what we presented, and then we'll take your questions at the end. So as you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat, and we'll save some time to respond to them. Without further ado, I'll let my co-presenters introduce themselves. Dan, you want to go first?
Sure. Dan Goldhaber. I'm jointly at the University of Washington at the American Institutes for Research, and I do quantitative work on teacher policy.
And hi, my name is Terra Wallin. I'm the Associate Director for P-12 Accountability at the Education Trust, but I started my career as a high school teacher in Jefferson Parish, Louisiana. So excited to have this conversation.
Wonderful. Okay, we're going to kind of jump into this issue by thinking about three interrelated problems that, if you work in education policy, are probably old hat to you. One of them is that test results have been widely available, especially for almost the last 20 years, since students have been taking them in grades 3 through 8. But for the most part, the biggest use of tests has been to measure school performance and to bring transparency to student performance at the systemic level, sometimes for other things like teacher accountability. But for years, the public has been skeptical, and I also think it's true to say increasingly skeptical about the value of annual testing. A lot of parents don't think we need to do it every year. A lot of educators don't think that we need to do it every year because the juice essentially isn't worth the squeeze. The second challenge that has been on our minds is family engagement. This is something that, as long as I have worked in education, everyone agrees is important and everyone talks about it, but no one is ever satisfied with where it is. It's really difficult to get families to engage the way that schools wish that they would and could. And there are consequences to this that have been well documented, including that there's a big mismatch between what many families expect for their children, meaning that families expect their kids to thrive in school, to graduate high school, to move on to higher education. And in fact, most families believe that their kids are going to achieve a post-secondary degree, and the trajectories that kids are on. Many times parents think things are going much better than they are. The third thing is, for the last 9 months, we've seen the COVID-19 pandemic disrupt education nationally. We will eventually get around to tallying up the number of instructional days that have been lost, but everybody, I think, agrees that it has just been a massive amount of instruction that's been altered or missed, and that in addition to that, we have students and families dealing with stress, trauma, social isolation. We're getting the sense of the learning losses, though we have much still to learn there. And we also have a lot of, I would say, fogginess about exactly where students stand. And that's true on any number of dimensions. It's not just due to, it's not just true that we need to learn more about where they are academically, but we also need to learn more about where they are socially and where they are in just a general child development sense, because we don't have any precedent for this. So those three problems are leading us to think about how do we deal with this and what's next. Two things that we have noticed, and possibly you have observed these things too, is that some districts are hesitating to acknowledge the lost learning that's occurred. This is an article that ran in late October in Chalkbeat and also the Associated Press, where the gist of it was, we can't get too caught up in the losses that students may have. We need to just get them back into school, get things back to normal, pick up where we left off, and kind of look forward as opposed to trying to reconstruct what may have been lost during this time. On the other hand, early reports, and this one is from a couple of weeks ago around Dallas, shows that students actually lost quite a bit of ground compared to where they otherwise would have been had there been no interruption in instruction. This is probably going to differ district to district, state to state, and certainly from student to student. But in the next year, in the next 2 years, there's just an enormous amount of exploration and work to do to figure out what has happened and how do we go forward from it. What we would like to offer you today is one way of thinking about that in a way that we can make tests more useful than they probably have been in the past. So the solution that we're going to walk through is that we do more personalized tracking of each child's on-track status, their progress, and their trajectory. And that number one, the first principle of this would be families need better information about whether their kids are on track or off track. There are a lot of ways to do this. We will argue here that using past test scores, and we'll be able to include future test scores in this equation as well, we actually can give parents better information than they've been getting. In the past, they've often been getting something like an achievement category, so they're on grade level or meeting expectations, which a lot of those things don't mean a lot to families. Scale scores mean even less. Even percentiles can be difficult to understand. We think it's possible to give families a much clearer and tangible understanding of how things are going for their kids and to use common measures from year to year. So we're going to walk you through that. The second thing is tests were not administered in the spring of 2020. So we have 1 year of data missing already. It's unclear if tests will be administered in the spring of 2021. We believe that we can make some useful projections and give parents some useful information using test scores that predate the pandemic, that even going back to test scores from 2019 and earlier can be helpful to both parents and educators. And we'll talk to you about how we see that coming together. The second thing is that information alone, I think, is clearly not enough to meet the challenges that we face. We need to give better information and more specific language to equip teachers to have these conversations with parents so they can communicate what they see and what the response can be instructionally. We have the work that we do at EdNavigator on a day-to-day basis is to partner with parents over the long term to do high-touch support as they navigate the educational process. And I will say that we've been doing this for 5.5 years with thousands of families. The challenge of communicating student progress is one of the most acute ones that teachers face. It is very difficult, especially to give challenging or bad news to families about how their kids are doing. It intimidates teachers, and they often are unsure about it. If we equip them with tools to do it better, I think they will do it better, and parents will also be more engaged. And we'll talk about how we see that happening. And then finally, the learning gaps that open up due to differences in access to really good instruction, we think are unlikely to close on their own. And Dan is going to present some slides in just a minute that are going to draw this point home. But I can't emphasize this enough. Based on what we have seen in our work together, the idea that the inequities that may have been exacerbated by the pandemic will somehow soften and perhaps disappear over time if all we do is get schools reopened and send kids back into them and then move forward, we think is extremely unlikely, and that we have enough evidence from the past to know this, and that it's going to take a different plan to get different results. Dan, take it away.
Great. So I should say that undergirding everything that Tim and I are saying here is this terrifically interesting academic paper. You can maybe hear a little sarcasm in my voice because it has a lot of, econometric and statistical details that most people won't be interested in. But if you are interested in it, I put the link into the chat so you can get some of the background that we are presenting, or that we're not having the time to present here. So I wanted to give you sort of the just in case slide, like what can you take away from this academic paper? And the first thing is that, as Tim mentioned, test results deserve attention in the sense that they predict all of these later life outcomes. What we look at are 3 high school outcomes. We look at 10th grade tests. We look at the probability that students take advanced courses in math, and we look at the likelihood of high school graduation, and we are using 3rd grade tests to predict all of those later life outcomes, 3rd grade and future tests to predict all those later life outcomes. And again, as Tim mentioned, the deficits that you can observe in the third grade, they typically do not just disappear. So one of the things that's quite striking is that, and you'll see this in subsequent slides, is that third grade tests are pretty accurate in predicting these high school outcomes. Eighth grade tests are a little bit more accurate, but the difference in accuracy between the third grade test and the eighth grade tests are not that great. And what that kind of suggests to us is that we probably are not intervening early enough in a kid's life in school to change their academic trajectory. But trajectory itself does matter. So if you think about two kids that have the sort of the same average test score over, third, fourth, and fifth grade, the kid who's got an upward trajectory from third to fifth grade is projected ultimately to do better in terms of these high school outcomes than the kid that has the same average test score over those 3 grades, but has a downward trajectory. Last thing is that the results that we're going to present are based on a couple of states, 3 states, and the states include information from millions and millions of students. So this is information that is generated from lots and lots of students over a very long panel. But it turns out that the estimates that you get from one state can easily be applied to another state. So while we're looking at these results just in these 3 states, we think that there's pretty good evidence in the paper that when you kind of standardize tests in the right way, that these kind of results can be used anywhere to do these kind of projections. All right, so here is sort of some of the bottom lines to what we are finding. What is on the horizontal or x-axis is the decile of the third grade test score. So, I don't know actually if you can see my cursor, but if you look at the 5 or the 0.5, maybe if my eyes are really good, those are students that are at the 50th percentile. And then the vertical axis, the y-axis on this slide, is the high school percentile that we predict based on those third grade tests on a 10th grade math test score. The difference between the solid line, which is students that are not free reduced lunch, and the dotted line, which is students that are free and reduced lunch, is the difference in those projections between students based on their third grade poverty level. So there are 2 things that I think you can take away from this slide. One is there's a very strong upward trajectory. If you do well in the, in the third grade on the test, you're likely to do well on the 10th grade in the test. Second thing is there's a pretty big gap between students that are free and reduced price lunch eligible receiving in the third grade and those that are not. It's about 10 percentage points. So there's actually quite a few high flying students in the third grade who are high poverty that end up falling back in the distribution. And I think that that's one of the important takeaways here. So 10th grade test scores is one of the outcomes we looked at. Here is a second outcome, which is the probability of taking advanced classes in math. And I won't say much more about this than what I said about the prior slide, other than you'd still see that there's a big gap between the free reduced lunch and the non-free reduced lunch students. And these third grade tests are predictive of something different than tests. They are predictive of the likelihood of taking advanced math courses in high school. Lastly, we looked at high school graduation, and these are all statistically significant predictions. The setup is the same, but most students end up graduating. So the lines here are a little bit flatter, but still, if you look at students that are in the middle of the distribution at the 50th percentile in third grade, there's about a 9-10 percentage point gap in the likelihood of students that are free and reduced price and non-free and reduced price lunch graduating. And if I were to say this a different way, thinking, about the average graduation rate of being, around 85, 90%, the likelihood that a student in the middle of the distribution does not graduate if she's free reduced price lunch eligible in the 3rd grade is twice the likelihood that the student doesn't graduate if they're not free reduced price lunch eligible. So that's important. I'm going to turn it back to Tim to talk about kind of what we are thinking you can do with these kinds of results.
So Dan and I started this work together a couple of years ago after sitting in a room all day talking about how to communicate results better to parents. And what you've just seen is the nitty-gritty of the analysis, which yielded some important insights that Dan walked through. But the ultimate goal here was to do something different for individual families and to help parents understand how their kids are progressing, how they can help, and to help educators understand the same thing. And so over the course of the last year, in partnership with Dan's organization, CALDER, we have created a tool that we call the Student Searchlight. It uses the information from the study to translate a couple of inputs, which would be a student's actual state test scores and a variety of demographics about the student, including their race, gender, their free lunch status, their special education participation, into 3 individual projections for that student. And as Dan mentioned, they are their 10th grade math percentile, their odds of completing advanced coursework in math in high school, and their high school graduation percentage. And the report looks something like what you see here on the right side of the screen. So for this student, we have a test score for 3rd grade in math and reading. Here are the demographics there, and then these are some results, which I'll go through in a little bit more detail. But what we've tried to do here is transfer from thinking about students as big groups and to try and think about how can we take this all the way down to the level of a single student to give better information to parents. There's a couple of things that Searchlight illuminates that may be new and useful to educators. And I'll dive into this with some examples in a minute, but there are a couple of things to keep in mind. One is we often hear about the importance of literacy by 3rd grade, and literacy is extremely important. But one thing that you may not realize is that math performance is actually more closely associated with long-term success than English language arts performance. And that's even true with things like high school graduation. And so it's important for us to keep both things in mind for early students. A student who's a very good reader but has real deficits in numeracy still faces some reduced odds of long-term success. The second thing is that there are certain traits where students of a similar academic performance have different likelihoods of achieving low future outcomes, and sometimes it may be surprising to folks. So for example, 2 students that are scoring the same on tests, one of them receives special education services and the other one does not. The student receiving special education services actually has a slightly higher likelihood of graduating high school, not lower. And again, this is for the same test score outcomes, but remember, a student who's receiving special education services has an IEP, regular meetings, there's a team of folks that are keeping an eye on them. Historically, we often thought about special education as a risk factor, and parents were often reluctant to have their kids evaluated for it. It actually turns out, if you look more closely, that students who are receiving those services may actually be more likely to graduate high school. And the third thing is that for about 20 years, we've had score categories on state tests, and one example would be partially meets expectations. We found in our analysis that there are students who stay in exactly the same score category for several years in a row, because remember, some of those score categories are pretty broad. They may cover students, say, from the 25th to the 50th percentile in one score category. There's usually only 4 of them. Sometimes there are more, but often only 4. And sometimes you can stay in the same achievement category several years in a row, but experience enough movement to truly move your future projections meaningfully. That would be pretty much invisible to most families. So if a student received partially meets expectations 3 years in a row, the parent would probably interpret that as, my student is in the same place. What we found is that is not necessarily true. A student actually can move quite a bit in terms of their future trajectory. So let's meet Robert. Robert is a student that we support at EdNavigator in Boston Public Schools. You'll see this report card here. that is from a couple of years ago. It's the 2017-18 school year. It's a standards-based report card where he is rated on all sorts of different dimensions. And I bet it is too small for you all to read the comments on the right side. So I'm going to see if I can read them out loud for you. For reading, his teacher in 3rd grade has said, enjoys pursuing their own reading interests independently, makes connections with other books and authors when reading. So good comment there for reading. For Robert. For writing, there's no comment. For math, it says engages in various types of work situations, i.e. alone, with a partner, in whole group discussion, communicates mathematical ideas using words, numbers, and pictures, uses math choice time productively, is self-directed, and makes independent choices. So on both math and reading, we have exclusively positive comments. The reading comments are a little surprising because if you look over at Robert's grades, he has 1s in reading and writing in some standards, which indicate that he is struggling there. But the comments don't elaborate on that. The only place we do see some cause for concern is under school leadership comments on the far right side of the report card, where it says benefits from adult redirection when confused, needs to accept responsibility for making good decisions. Robert is a pretty common case where a parent would be looking at this report card, which has well over 100 individual data points on it, and probably would take away the impression that this student is in relatively decent shape. Robert has never taken MCAS, which is the state test, at the point that this report card came out. Remember, well, he would have sat for it, but the results wouldn't be back yet. And so that year, Robert did take the test for the first time. And when he got his result, this is how he did. His scale score in math was 489. His scale score in reading was 456. What that means is that his math performance is at the 35th percentile, but his ELA performance is essentially at the very bottom of the scale, meaning that almost no students in the state of Massachusetts score lower than Robert did. And based on that profile, he is projected to perform in 10th grade at the 15th percentile in math, and his risk of not graduating high school is already elevated at 35%. I would argue that the report card that we just looked at together is not an accurate representation of Robert's progress or his needs. In particular, I take issue with the comments. And the idea behind Searchlight is that instead of having a conversation that looks like the report card, I would say something more similar to this. Well, if we did like a form letter based on Searchlight, it probably would read like this at the top. Let me read that first. This is how not to do it, we think. We regret to inform you that based on your child's performance on the Massachusetts Comprehensive Assessment System, he has been identified as being at risk for future academic failure, such as dropping out of high school. Please contact this office if you have questions. Some early warning things in the past have been like that. They can be off-putting and scary to parents because remember, Robert is an adorable little 3rd grader who has lots of school in front of him. What we envision is something like this with his family. I'm reaching out to review Robert's progress in school. Currently, I'm concerned about his performance in math and reading. Students with results similar to Robert's tend to struggle with the challenges of high school just a few years from now. In fact, they graduate less often. However, I want you to know that we can change this picture by supporting Robert. And then I'm proposing the following types of things. What we hope happens is something like this. If over the next 2 years in 4th and 5th grade, Robert improves, and when I say improve, I mean he makes some really nice steps forward to the point where he's at the state average by 5th grade. So he takes a stair step up in 4th grade, and by 5th grade for language arts and math, he's right at the 50th percentile. He has the same demographics that he had before. If that happens, his probability of completing advanced coursework in high school goes from 35% to 56%. That means completing courses that go beyond what's required for graduation. So, the chance to, for instance, take trigonometry as a senior, his chances of that have gone up significantly. His 10th grade math performance projection improves from the 15th to the 39th percentile, which is an enormous change. And his risk of not graduating high school drops from 35 to 26%, basically cutting in half the gap between Robert and the typical student. So it reduces that elevated risk that we saw really substantially. And remember, we're talking about 2 years of time We're not moving him from the bottom of the distribution all the way to the top. It is a pretty sizable jump, not one easily attained. I don't want to dismiss that, but his demographics remain the same. What this shows is that early results are highly predictive, but they are not destiny. When students get better instruction and they get the benefit of that instruction, the projections also shift in ways that we can see. And we hope then that the message for Robert's parents changes, and it says something more like, I'm reaching out to review Robert's progress in school. Over the past 2 years, he's improved significantly in both math and reading. His results indicate that Robert is now much better prepared for the challenges of high school. In fact, his risk of not graduating from high school has dropped quite a bit. Based on the path he is on, we should discuss the classes he will take going forward, because his performance suggests he will be ready to complete advanced courses in high school. This is a message that a parent would love to get, and I think it's one that a parent would be very responsive to. By this point, with Robert being a 5th grader, probably starting 6th grade, it's probably a message he would like to hear as well. Dan, I think 17 to 19 are yours.
All right. First thing I want to note is that there's a question from Melissa, and I want to let you know, Melissa, that we see the question and encourage other people, if they have questions, to put those in the box, because we will have some time at the end to engage in question and answer and discussion. So we've sort of thought about what can you do with this information, and I think that there are a couple of different things that can be done with this information, and I don't want to go through all of this, but I want to say that it's about helping to both inform parents and hopefully encourage better conversations between parents and teachers. And this might both be creating some common language across schools in a district and schools throughout a state. Some prompting so that parents have clear information and they can maybe engage with schools in ways that they hadn't known in the past. And that it is not merely about the students that are struggling. Recall that one of the things that we see is that there are a lot of high achieving students, disproportionately disadvantaged, historically disadvantaged students, that slip back in the distribution. So one could also use this tool as a kind of, hey, this is a kid who's doing great. They're on a really good trajectory, and make sure that the parents get that message reinforced, so that hopefully it reinforces the good things that are going on in the home that help lead to good academic achievement. So I think that it's all about communication, and we basically want to make the communication much more salient to parents than it is right now. Recall the assessment that Tim put up earlier about Robert. I think it's probably easy for a lot of parents to ignore some of the important details that are in that kind of assessment. All right. So let's talk a little bit more about the moment that we are in. Tim and I began this project pre-COVID, and we've been working on it on the 3, 4, 8 years of COVID that we've all experienced. But we didn't obviously foresee that it would have a moment today, but I think it has a moment today in a couple of different ways. I've articulated the fact that it can be used as a parent, hopefully used as a parent engagement and communication tool. But also I think that for students that have previously taken assessments, it does a remarkably good job of sort of projecting where students are, even in the absence of assessments in every year. So knowing where a kid is in grades 3 and 4, and then not having information in grade 5, you can still make quite a good projection about where they're going to be in the 6th grade. And I think that it's important to harness the power of big data to try and make those projections as we are trying to get the kids back on, a good trajectory that we know are going to suffer in relation to the pandemic. And then again, I want to just emphasize sort of this last issue, that we're trying to make it something, we're trying to make these results salient to parents. So right now we've gone through high school. We have every reason to believe that these kind of projections are going to be relevant when we talk about, college outcomes. But I think that that's the way a lot of parents think is my child on track to graduate high school? Might they go to college? And if you talk to a lot of parents and students, that is their expectation. when kids are young. And so it's not that parents don't have high expectations, it's that somehow those expectations get lost along the way. And I think part of the getting lost is that it's just really hard to give, sometimes for teachers to give parents accurate assessments of where their kids are, particularly early on, because you think, oh, they've got their whole K-12 career to get back on track. But part of getting back on track is making sure that you're intervening early when intervening really matters. All right, so we've got a couple of discussion sessions that are teed up for Terra. And I think I'm gonna just modify them just a little bit to say, you know, Terra, on this first question about the use of tests, you know, is it sort of your assessment that tests have typically been used in the way that Tim and I are discussing in the past, or does this actually represent a different way of trying to use tests? How do you see this in today's environment around the discussion of high stakes testing? So that's question one. Question two is, you know, what are some of the risks? When Tim and I have been out talking to policymakers about it, one of the things that people bring up is, hey, what if we give parents bad information? Not bad information. What if we give parents information that suggests their kids are not doing well early on? Could they be demoralized, and could that actually hurt their achievement going forward? And then, how do you see what we're sort of talking about here integrating with other kinds of non-test measures, other kinds of developmental measures? So I think, Terra, take it away in whatever direction you see fit, and we'll try and preserve 10, 15 minutes at the end to open it up for questions.
Thanks, Ann, and thanks, Tim. That was a lot of questions, so I'm going to get started. I'm going to encourage other people who have questions, continue to submit those via the chat, the room chat, or the Q&A function. We'll definitely make time, try to address them as we're going. I think as I was thinking about this paper and even in real time reflecting on this presentation, I think a couple of things come to mind for me. I think first, I just think about the value of honesty and being honest with parents about where their students are performing. And I think what we're seeing in some of the pushback, and you just referenced, is this concern that somehow being honest will be demoralizing. And I think that's really because of the way that tests have been used in the past. So I think back to a couple of things. When I started teaching, I remember being sent an article through my preparation program that was about how a local community was basing kind of the size of its legal and justice facilities based on third grade reading scores, right? At some point, somebody's seen that article that's looking at third grade data and then making predictions about students' outcomes. I think that's a real risk here, right? The other way that article could have been written would have been instead to say, we have a lot of third graders who need extra support. Let's give them the extra support so that doesn't happen, instead of assuming that those students were going to stay on the same path. And so I think that that's the thing here, which I think Tim pointed out, but we just have to keep in mind, is that data is a tool, right? It should be a flashlight that gives us honest information about what's happening, but it can be used negatively. And I think particularly for communities of color, their experience with testing has been that it's been used negatively, right? Or they haven't been given the information about the supports, or frankly, we have this kind of inequitable distribution of resources across schools and districts. And if there aren't supports to access, then what do you do with this, right? It would be demoralizing to get that information and not have an idea of what comes next. So I think we have to keep in mind that this honesty is important and that parents want the information. I think the other thing we have to think about is that what happens frequently with tests, I think what you started to outline is, and some of this is driven in federal law, right? We have this requirement that states have to give parents test information, but they even have to give them kind of data points on different dimensions within the test, right? So you get your child score on the Virginia Standards of Learning, and it's an overall math score, but then it says on fractions this, on algebraic expressions this. It's really complicated, right? What does that actually mean, and what do you do with it? I was talking to a colleague who works in assessments, has run a state assessment system. His child took a diagnostic test this fall. He got a scale score back. No idea what it meant. He was like, all I could think to do was look at her score from last year and see if it was the same or different. I don't even know if they're the same scale. And he started asking the teacher questions. And she said, well, I think it's really good in terms of distribution. We're going to keep working on reading and math, right? But even the teacher wasn't equipped with what the level of supports could be. And I think that's the other important thing here is how do you equip teachers to communicate this and to actually identify the supports that you want to offer to students, right? Give them opportunities to learn. So I think those things are important. And I think just in terms of value of state assessment data broadly, I would say, I think one of the things you point out is that there is real value to this data in predicting some long-term outcomes. We have to be sure, it's not used negatively or in a deficit framing, but that data is important. Learning Heroes did some surveying this spring. I think it was in May. So many parents probably had more insight into what their students were learning given the shutdowns that happened in most places in March. But 92% of parents said that their student was on grade level. And I think that may be because they don't really know what being on grade level means, right? So they think, well, they've turned in their things, or I see them working on something that must mean they're on track. They don't necessarily know what it means. Or they're getting information like grades or report cards that isn't clear to them. And I think one value that state assessments have, right, is actually giving them some measure of whether their student is really grade level or on track. And I think that's one of the real risks we run if we don't have state assessments this spring. Is parents are hungry for information right now. They don't know exactly where their students are at. And if they go 2 years without having that data, I think the example here, right, showed how different Robert's outcomes could be over a 2 years period with additional support, right? If we think of this COVID, this 2 school years of interrupted learning, and hopefully it's just these 2, that's a lot of time. And students are going to need support. And we know particularly students of color, students from low-income background, English learners, students with disabilities, the communities that were already vulnerable before are even more vulnerable now. And so I think this just articulates why we need that state assessment data going forward. But I think Tim started the presentation and we would say the same thing, right? Which is data alone isn't going to close an opportunity gap. It's not going to change an outcome for a student. It's not going to drive improvement. But it should be something that's used to identify what supports a student needs to go forward. And I think one of the important things in the examples you shared about how you communicate is this should be focused not on fixing kids, right? Not on deficits of students, but on the additional supports that those students will need moving forward. And I think part of that is academic, right? So if I was finishing off the ... in the sentence, would love to see, your student could benefit from intensive tutoring. Here's somewhere that's offered nearby. Your student may benefit from expanded learning time. Here's an opportunity to attend something on Saturdays or over the summer or extended school day, right? Actually linking the direct supports that parents can access. But particularly in a year when students' experience are so vastly different, we need other data to contextualize that. And so I think some of that is about the kind of mode of learning, but it's also just some measures of the student experience. And those should inform the supports, right? There may be social, emotional, or mental health or physical health needs for the student that they're going to need those supports along with the rigorous academic support, to change these trajectories, to improve their likelihood of graduating or going to college or pursuing whatever profession that they want. And so I think it's important that states are thinking about how to collect that information alongside this test data. And then they're thinking about how they support teachers and using the combination of that to actually recommend supports or interventions or additional strategies that students can access, right? We sometimes go back to this example of, well, the student is having difficulty accessing the information because they don't have glasses and they need glasses, right? Hopefully the report that you provide to parents at the end of the year would say, here's an opportunity for more tutoring, and here's an opportunity for your student to get the physical or mental health supports they need to go alongside that. And so I think we have to be thinking about collecting this information together. And then how do you help teachers make sense of that information, or schools or school districts to actually recommend supports, right? So what makes sense for a student who has physical health needs? What makes help for students who have may need some kind of wraparound supports that can be provided in the community, not necessarily in the school. How do you communicate that to parents when they have a lot of different things coming at them? And this environment is really important. And then, you know, the last thing I'll say, and then would love to have time for questions, is I don't love the use of medical analogies in education. Right. I think sometimes they hit the mark and sometimes they miss the point. But I do think a little bit of this, like if you went to a doctor, I think particularly for maybe those of us who have been home and sedentary a little more lately, right? If you go to your doctor and they say, hey, your blood pressure's gone up a little bit, we should just be watching this. In the future, this could turn into hypertension or something bad. So add a few more vegetables, maybe add 30 minutes of walking a week, right? We'd want them to do that. We wouldn't want to go into the doctor and have them see that and just not say anything because they were worried it would upset us to know that over the last year, our behaviors have impacted our health, right? We'd want them to tell us what could happen in the long term, but we'd also want them to give us suggestions about what to do, right? It doesn't do you any good if your doctor says, hey, your blood pressure is high, you're going to get hypertension. You need them to tell you, eat vegetables, take a walk. Here are some things you can do. And I think that's very much the case here. We want these tests to provide honest information to parents, but we also wanted to give them solutions or supports that they can do to change what the outcomes might look like if they're concerned or they're unhappy about where their student is. So I'm going to stop there. I know the chat's been going. I haven't been monitoring, so I'm going to let Tim or Dan jump in if there's specific questions.
So I was going to jump in and just verbally answer a question that Melissa asked earlier, and it was quite a good question because I think the underlying concern is, well, what about these advanced courses? Do kids have kind of equal opportunities to take these courses across different high schools? And the answer is no, not always. We estimated some models that for the statistically wonky out there included school fixed effects, and the results don't change. So we were explicitly accounting for the possibilities of differential opportunities. And that really, I could have put up the exact same charts. So that doesn't explain what we're seeing on that front. And then there's a question here from Adriana that I throw open, you know, Tim, to you and Terra, is just what do you think is going to happen when, you know, because you've got parents that are kind of more engaged with their children's schooling because they have to be with all the virtual learning that's going on.
Yeah, I think that so far for us, the impact has been different based on the family's experience. There are cases where families are now much more engaged and they're seeing their kids struggle and they realize things are not as easy as I thought that they were. But another thing that we have noticed, and I wish that I had more quantitative information to bring to bear on this, I just don't, is we're concerned that report cards have gotten even more inflated than before. So if you remember last year in the spring, many districts said your grades can go up, but they can't go down. During the pandemic, they didn't want to discourage students and at-home learning was difficult, but a lot of kids basically got really rosy grades last spring. That has continued this fall. A lot of report cards that we look at are suddenly, you know, a student seems to have gone from a place of real struggle to almost universal success. And we have a lot of questions about whether that is a reflection of real mastery of material or whether it is a way that we're all negotiating the pandemic. But the phenomenon that Terra mentioned, Learning Heroes has documented a number of times, which is that parents tend to think that things are going really well. I think we should keep a watch on that. And there's some chance that that actually gets worse, not better for some families. And it's another thing to keep in mind when we have this discussion about whether or not to test students this spring, because the tests are one way that families get a kind of anchored view into their child's achievement as opposed to just a report card. And again, every district, every school is different. I think there are a lot of different approaches to that. But I will say I have reviewed a number of report cards this fall that gave me some cause for concern. And then Mike Goldstein has a question here about whether or not there is ever been a hotline where parents can get a straight answer about how what their child's test scores mean. I have not seen that, and I would say in general, this differs from place to place, but particularly in schools where a lot of students are struggling, we do see a tendency to underplay the tests. They're often given back in the fall. Sometimes they're just mailed home with no real explanation. And a big missed opportunity is that it is relatively uncommon for a teacher in the new school year, August, September, who is inheriting a student who took the test the previous year, to discuss that student's results because they weren't the teacher at the time the test was given. And so in many cases, they think of it as, hey, it's a clean slate. She wasn't my student back in March when she took this test. They tend to kind of turn the page and move to the new school year. So if anything, I would say we have a ways to go just to make sure that we do basic communication of the results effectively before we go to more advanced things. I do think the idea that Mike suggests where parents can kind of go to an impartial source is one worth considering. Dan or Terra, anything to add on those or other questions you guys saw that you want to jump in on?
Why don't you jump in?
I was just going to add two things. I think one other thing, what do we know about how this school year is? It feels like there's so many things we don't know, frankly. But I think, I actually think it was AIR, if I'm remembering correctly, did some surveying. And I think one of the things we're seeing is that in a lot of high poverty districts, they're spending a lot of time reviewing content rather than teaching new content. And I think that's not necessarily the same thing that you're seeing in your higher income districts. And I think that plays out along racial ethnic lines, given how segregated our schools are. And so I do worry that also parents are going to get an inflated view of their student mastering information they are being retaught that they should have learned last year, right? And so I think we think of the state test as kind of one dipstick of whether they're moving along and what they're going to need to graduate college and career ready. I think the other thing that everyone has pointed out is we know state tests may look different this spring, right? There are places who are moving to shorten their tests, like in California. There are some who are thinking about administering assessments remotely, right? So we saw this on scale last year with College Board, doing AP tests at home on cell phones. We don't know exactly what it's going to look like for state tests next year, but I think one of the things we're watching and really concerned about is states aren't providing a lot of tools right now to educators or parents about what to expect, right? And they need to be thinking pretty deeply about how they support educators with what testing might look like, how the data is going to be used, and how they can communicate to parents and families about it. Because I think there's two windows. There's kind of the leading up to the testing, understand what's going to happen and why it's important. And then on the backside, understanding what the data means. And I think we have to think about both of those. And we have a window of opportunity right now to be thinking about how you communicate on the front end. And how do you get the scores back quicker, right? To your point, this normally happens in the fall, and I think that's difficult. And I know people are trying to push back testing this year, so that might be even harder. But you can get preliminary scores pretty quick. And so how do you think about sharing those out with families in this kind of setting and say, this is preliminary, we're taking another look, but here's an idea and here's what support for over the summer could look like. I think we have to recognize the moment in time we're in and think about how we adapt this for this year.
Yeah, that's a great point, Terra. And I'm going to answer a question that we get all the time that I don't know if anybody's put this in the chat or not, but we often get folks who ask us, if you were a state, what would you do at this time? And one, I have enormous sympathy for the folks that are working in state education agencies right now and for all the things that they have been grappling with. But one thing that you could do is go back to the test results that you have from the past, 2019 and earlier, and establish a baseline. And then at some point, you're going to get a sense of where students are, whether it's 2021, if in this spring you're able to test your students, that's one possibility. Maybe it comes later. But by doing the pre-work, you can then communicate with parents, has your child's trajectory changed? And you could start your recovery work, your academic tutoring, your support, your invitations for additional resources with students whose trajectory has meaningfully changed. And I think we'll probably find that it varies, again, student to student, but the baseline work can be done now to look at prior data sets and to say what trajectory were my students on up to that point. All that data is already in-house up through 2019. And based on what Dan and I saw in the research project, students do not change trajectory all that often. It definitely does happen, but where a student was in 2019 is not a bad starting place to think about who is going to need support when the pandemic is over. It's probably going to be the students that were already in a more challenging spot. And so while it's not easy to do, I would urge states to think about what is possible with data you already have to lay the groundwork for new data that you might get, and also how can you begin connecting that with parent communication mechanisms. Teachers need support to do that. It's easier said than done to get a parent's attention on something like this, but I think that work is really important and can be done now.
Okay. I know Dan dropped off for a second, is back. I didn't know if you wanted to add anything to that.
I'm not sure where what I missed. So
I said all the clever stuff, Dan, all the really smart stuff right when you were off.
Terra, I want to come back to this issue about how tests are used, and it's a little bit it's connected to Michael Goldstein's question, and it's nice to see your name, Michael. But like, what is your? Have you seen school systems that are sort of sophisticated in the way that they are like taking the kids' 3rd grade test and informing what that means they're doing in 4th grade, and have prompts for the teachers to say, here's how you might use this, given these test scores, this is how you might communicate things to parents, or that they are sending information out to parents in ways that, and I guess this is right up your alley too, Tim, that is useful. Every time I sort of think about this issue, I think about the little tiny writing that comes when I get a credit card, or I log on to a new website, and there's 3 pages of very detailed information that I don't read because I don't have time. I just click the acknowledge box and move on. And I guess I just worry that that's the way that tests have been used in terms of communication. So I'm wondering if there's any case where you can say, no, I've actually seen something really interesting that's different. Obviously, EdNavigator apart, because that is interesting and different.
Yeah, I mean, if Tim has great examples, I will say at the national level, we don't see a ton of these. I think a couple of things we've seen, I think particularly as states were changing their assessments and moving to the kind of college and career ready assessments, which at the time many states were doing Smarter Balance or the PERC assessment and have since changed. They did think about in that assessment transition, we saw some people thinking about how they give more information on the front end about what to expect and what you're going to get back with your scores. I think that really came from a fear that scores were going to drop significantly, right? And so they were pre-thinking how to address that. And I was just talking to a colleague who was talking about the fact that her child's school does like a test night, right? Where they say like, hey, in May, your kid's going to be taking this test. This is what it can tell you. This is why it's important. This is what you should be thinking about the day that your student comes in. This is how we use the results, right? I think there's the front end of that. I think on the other side, would love to hear if there's when the reports come back. We've seen a little bit of for state accountability systems, which are very different, right? But kind of the reporting of what a school or district is doing. I think New Mexico at one point did some pretty interesting stuff where they kind of came up with these like very catchy YouTube videos that helped walk a parent through what the school report card means. What does it mean to get a 97 in this rating? And what's the school gonna, what are the things the school may be doing differently the next year? Or, hey, the school has to come up with a plan. Here's how you can find that plan. And we'd love to see if there are people thinking creatively about how to do that at the individual student level for a parent. And I think in particular, when we think about parents who speak other languages, parents who have disabilities, all those, right? Like, what are ways you can use multimedia to help them understand this, credit card agreement that they get in the mail?
Yeah, that's a good point. I'll give a positive and a negative example. Both these come from Louisiana, and we've been talking a lot about students that may need extra support, but the other side of the coin is just as important. What about students that are doing very well? As Dan showed us earlier, students who are doing really well who qualify for free lunch typically slide over time. They don't stay on the same high trajectory. And a couple of years ago in Louisiana, we partnered with the Department of Education there, which is a fantastic group of folks, to try and do an experiment around that. One of the districts that we approached, we said we would like to celebrate students that are doing really well to help them stay on that path. And the district said, oh, no, we're totally covered in that area. We already have a celebration. And we said, oh, great, what is it? Kind of along the lines of what Terra was saying. We were looking for an innovative practice. And this was, obviously years pre-pandemic. They said, we stream our school board meetings live, and we read the kids' names out loud at the school board meeting that we stream. And I was picturing like 4 people in the audience at this school board meeting. Most parents wouldn't even know that was happening, probably unlikely to affect the students' later performance. We worked with the state to do an experiment where we mailed big celebratory packets to kids based on their performance on state tests if they had done really well. And then we put a certificate in there and a gift card for a meal at a fast food restaurant. And the next year when the kids took the test again, the students in the sample who were Black did score higher in language arts than the students who had scored just as high the previous year and were randomly selected but didn't receive that packet. It's been very interesting to us. We were actually, just as the pandemic came on, about to try that experiment again in Louisiana when it became infeasible because the tests were canceled. But something that I would leave folks with is we do need more innovation in this area, and there is nothing more fulfilling and fun than just telling kids that they're doing a great job and celebrating it. It's enormously, restorative, whether or not the kids do better on the test the next year or not. We actually had one of the New Orleans Saints players last year wrote a letter and signed it that was going to go in the packets. Everybody kind of wanted to get in on it. So if we could do more of that to also make use of test scores to alert families and to students about future opportunities, I think that would also be a hugely important purpose.
Tim, the only thing that we've got like 2 minutes left or something, but I just I wanted to advertise a little bit and say that we have this tool that we have now developed, and we're looking at places that might be interested in testing it. It's not fully developed, but we are interested in finding partners that might want to think about using this kind of information for communication. I can't tell if everybody is frozen or if I'm the one who's frozen. Oh, okay. the joys of remote.
Yeah, it happens.
I'm going to do one more check. I don't see anything in the chat, so maybe we should just say it was nice to be here. And Terra, thank you, and thanks to all those that joined us.
Yeah, thank you so much. So grateful for your time. Thanks to Dan and Terra, and we hope the rest of the conference is great for you. If you
Now I think Tim is frozen for sure, but that seems like the way to end a virtual session in 2020.
Thank you. Last thing I'd say is just if you have follow-up thoughts, questions, don't hesitate to reach out. Tim and I certainly, I don't want to volunteer you, Terra. We don't know each other that well, but Tim and I are both easy to find, and we'd be happy to talk more about this.